Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to webinar number 4 in the IrBEA Conference Special Webinar Series. My name is Sean Finan, I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association, and this morning's webinar we will focus on COP Goal number 4, working together, and we will also receive some live updates from our speakers who are attending COP and also keeping an eye on the developments there. Our first 3 webinars are focused on the first 3 goals of COP, and you would have heard a lot about the discussions that are taking place in the media over the last week. Before we kick off this morning, I just want to remind you about an upcoming webinar which we're going to be involved in, which takes place this day 2 weeks on Wednesday the 24th of November. So instead of a morning session, it's moving to an afternoon session, 14:30 to 15:45, and it's focused on the transport system, options for a sustainable Irish transport system, how to achieve carbon neutrality. And for that webinar, we're in partnership with the Embassy of Brazil in Dublin, and a number of very interesting speakers, including representatives from the Brazilian Bioenergy Association, the Swedish Bioenergy Association, and indeed, James, who's joining us this morning, will also join on that call to discuss the role of ethanol in terms of the transport system. So I invite you to follow our social media channels to see the registration details or find the registration details for that webinar. So this morning's webinar, we're delighted to be joined by Kiara Zennaro from the Renewable Energy Association, by James Cogan from Ethanol Europe, and Paddy Phelan, our IrBEA president. So our first presentation this morning, we will hear from Kiara, who will outline to us the various developments in terms of COP, what has been discussed, what has been agreed, what impact it has on our industry from a bioenergy perspective, and also give us an outline of her own work in the areas of renewable heat, and indeed in work of her association in the general bioenergy area. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Kiara to turn on your camera. The Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technologies in the UK is a broad ranging organisation which covers all of the main renewable energy technologies. It was established in 2007, and Kiara is Head of Heat, Green Gas Lead with the REA. So thanks very much, Kiara, for joining us this morning, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. So over to you, and if you have any questions for any of our panelists or any comment or feedback, I'd encourage you to please post them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So and just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards on our website and also circulated to attendees. So over to you, Kiara.
Thank you very much, Sean, for the introduction, and also for inviting me to join this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here today. So yes, as you mentioned, I work for the REA as a Head of Heat, and I'm the Green Gas Lead. Can you hear me and see my screen, by the way? Can someone confirm?
Yes, we can. Yes, everything is perfect.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if you are not aware or familiar with the IEA, we are the largest UK-based trade association for renewable energy and clean technologies, mostly based in the UK, as I said. We have over 500 members that operate across heat, power, transport, and the circular bioeconomy or bioresources. So our members vary quite range from energy utilities and large renewable energy developers working across multiple technologies through to organizations and companies that develop more niche, innovative technologies and solutions. And we do represent our members through a number of member forums. We have 14 member forums at the moment, representing the full spectrum of renewable energy and clean technologies. And we have 5 member forums that are involved specifically in the bioenergy sector. And this includes our really long established Green Gas Forum, which includes around 200 companies involved in the biogas and biomethane supply chain. And more recently, we also rebranded to include other green gases such as hydrogen. So we have a hydrogen working group that is working to inform policy and move the agenda forward for clean hydrogen. We also have a Biomass Power Forum, a Wood Heat Forum, a Renewable Transport Fuel Forum, and also a Waste to Energy Forum, which includes a subgroup on gasification and pyrolysis. So we have a long history of involvement in the bioenergy sector. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key announcements made at COP26, particularly last week. There were some really encouraging and positive announcements that we should highlight. We should also stress that all of these are pledges, promises that are not legally binding, so they sit, at least for the time being, outside the legal framework of the Paris Agreement. And as our Prime Minister said today, now these promises need to be turned into action. And as you may know, earlier this morning, our government released a draft new agreement, which is basically a revised Paris Agreement. So hopefully the really key milestones and negotiation will happen in the last few hours of COP. But anyway, in terms of the key announcement made this week, the end coal announcement is very important. So over 40 countries agreed to phase out, to shift away from use of coal in power. Particularly the biggest coal using countries have agreed to do it in the 2030s, with the smaller economies have agreed to do it in the 2040s. Obviously, the main criticism with this positive commitment is that some countries like China or India didn't sign the agreement. And then the global methane pledge is certainly very important, and I dedicated a slide on it. It's the following slide, actually. There have been very important financial commitments made at COP last week. So about 450 organizations, for example, that control 40% of the world's capital have agreed to back clean technology and win the world of fossil fuels. And many other financial commitments were actually made last week as well. And of course, the trees one is very important. So over 100 countries agreed to tackle deforestation, and they signed the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, which commits to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. So as I said, the global methane pledge is very important. That was launched by the US and the EU, but has been signed by over 100 countries, which agreed to cut their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And that's very important because, as you know, methane over a 100-year timescale is up to 34 times more powerful in terms of global warming potential than CO2. So very important agreement made here. And again, the last one I wanted to mention, because it's also very important, because ultimately the large businesses and corporates are the companies that are going to drive this change. More than 2,000 companies of all sizes joined the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, which is the largest ever alliance where businesses have agreed to cut their emissions to zero by 2050. So, so let's come to the role of bioenergy. I think there's absolutely international consensus across the international communities that bioenergy has a key role to play to meet the COP commitments and cut emissions over the next decades. Bioenergy is important because, as highlighted by a number of scientific bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency, can replace fossil fuels by providing a reliable and dispatchable source of energy that can back up more variable sources of clean energy, such as wind and solar. Not just that, but in the sixth assessment report, the IPCC also acknowledged that BECCS, so bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, is absolutely fundamental to deliver negative emissions, which will be needed to really offset all the residual emissions that would be left from really hard to abate sectors such as aviation and agriculture. So yes, widely recognized really bioenergy as a critical role to play. And the chart shows the ambitious growth that is needed in bioenergy to cut emissions and reach the net zero target, as highlighted by the latest IEA Net Zero by 2050 report. So the IEA have said that basically industry will need to increase its output almost threefold to supply over 20% of the world's energy needs by 2050, and this is the bioenergy sector. This chart also shows the important contribution of bioenergy up to the 2050 of the total energy mix. So as you can see, the green and blue and light blue bands represent the gaseous bioenergy, liquid and solid bioenergy, and their shares in the energy mix will increase over time on the way to 2050. And also the IEA said that bioenergy sector globally will provide emission reduction of 2.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030 and 3.9 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050, totaling 11% of the total greenhouse gases emission reductions. So coming to the UK, because that's where my expertise is, I think is, I mean, the role and crucial role of bioenergy and also BECCS is again recognized by a number of stakeholders, including government, including the Committee on Climate Change, which is the independent statutory body which advises our government on climate change policies, and also industry. So since 2012, a number of reports have been published on bioenergy, starting with the 2012 UK government bioenergy strategy. There have been a number of publications from the Climate Change Committee and also industry publications such as our own bioenergy strategy that we published in 2019, all recognizing the important role that bioenergy can play in reaching net zero. But for the UK, really the important question is not whether biomass or bioenergy will play an important role. Is more a question of recognizing that biomass is limited, sustainable biomass is limited. How best should be directed? Where should it be used? So our government is planning to issue a biomass strategy in 2022 to really make some strategic decision on where the biomass should go, should be directed. And in advance of that publication, last week they released an important statement. It's called the Biomass Policy Statement, where they give an initial strategic view on the role of biomass across the economy in the medium to long term. So I've taken a nice flow chart from the biomass statement from the government last week, which sets out some overarching principles that should be used when we decide where biomass should be directed, for what uses biomass should be directed. And really, there's very little that we can disagree with in these principles. For me, they're really common sense. So clearly, biomass needs to be sustainable. Any biomass that is used for bioenergy or for other uses needs to be sustainable and meet the latest and most up-to-date science-based sustainability criteria. It needs to comply with any relevant air quality standards and targets and regulatory requirements. Within the short term, obviously, we need to reach net zero. We need to utilize any existing infrastructure or already planned investments, and we need to make sure that any new development doesn't undermine or result in infrastructure lock-in and undermine any longer term developments that are needed to meet net zero. Other important factors that need to be considered in the long term. In the longer term are obviously the availability of biomass feedstocks, cost benefits, and also the full life cycle greenhouse gases emission savings of bioenergy. And also our government will only support bioenergy when it's combined with carbon capture and storage, or in cases where CCS is not possible, is not feasible, then this should be directed to really hard to abate sectors such as I said earlier, aviation, agriculture, or industry that is really hard to abate, cement, steel, lime, for example. And finally, again, common sense principle, the biomass should be used according to the waste hierarchy and, according to the principles of a circular economy. So this table here really shows what we achieved in the UK so far in terms of bioenergy. So in the power sector, for example, bioenergy in 2019 has provided 28% of renewable power, and the majority of heat and transport in 2019 were provided by bioenergy. And you can see in the last column there, the significant greenhouse gas emission savings that have been delivered by bioenergy through a combination of technologies. Not just one technology, is a combination of multiple technologies from a wide range of feedstocks. So I suppose what is the key message of this slide is that bioenergy is an established sector, and the government should make sure that in their upcoming biomass strategy, they can set out some principles on how biomass should be best directed, but they should try to not ban end users, but just setting some principle, make sure they don't restrict or constrain new investment, new development, let the market decide what will happen in line with those principles, and also make sure you build on the existing markets across power, heat, and transport that can immediately displace fossil fuel and deliver greenhouse gas emission savings. It's good to look into the future. It's good to look at future technology like BECCS, like hydrogen, but in doing so, make sure you don't undermine existing market. Continue to support existing markets. This is a table that is taken from the latest biomass policy statement that was released by the government last week, and really shows the combination of technologies that are seen as strategic really in a low carbon economy and to deliver net zero. And just going quickly through it, in the power sector, our government is seeing biomass power is key, but only when it's combined with CCS. So our government will not support biomass power in the future if it's not combined with CCS. They also see energy from waste, again, combined with CCS, as very important to deliver a net zero power system. In the heat sector, again, a combination of biomass technologies will be really important. For example, solid biomass and liquid biofuels are seen very important to, well, by industry especially, but also government recognizes that they are important to decarbonize some really difficult to electrify properties, such as rural properties of the gas grid, the provision that biomass meets sustainability and air quality rules. Biomethane is also seen as fundamental, and as low regret options is a technology that is available now, is commercially available. It can be used to advance the decarbonization of the gas grid now, waiting for other technologies such as hydrogen to be ready in the future. Heat networks are seen by our government as very important. They can, according to the Committee on Climate Change, meet 18% of heat demand by 2050. And in terms of the role of hydrogen, and in this case biohydrogen, because we're talking about bioenergy in heating, that's still a little uncertain from the government perspective. They have postponed any decisions on it until 2026, subject to the outcome of any safety feasibility trials that are being currently undertaken. Industry-wise, again, bioenergy has certainly a role in really hard to electrify applications, and combined with CCS, for example, biomass use is often mentioned in high temperature fuel switching applications where electrification really struggles. Also, biogas and biomethane have a role to play in, again, decarbonizing industry. Biohydrogen, when it becomes commercially available, is also seen as very important to decarbonize some of the really hard to electrify sectors. Heat networks, again, there can play an important role. And finally, transport. So our government sees that by 2050, all biofuels should be directed to aviation, because that's really difficult to decarbonize, and that should be done in conjunction with CCS. However, our government also acknowledges that gaseous and liquid biofuels will still play an important role in the near term, because they can deliver immediate greenhouse gas emission savings, because they are already available. And the more we can front load these savings, the better from a carbon budget perspective. And certainly, fuels like biomethane will certainly play an important role in the near term to decarbonize heavy good vehicles, which are really difficult and challenging to decarbonize. Again, hydrogen is seen as an important one to decarbonize the transport sector, and there's trials and underway. So I think we're getting there in terms of deploying hydrogen in the transport sector, and also sustainable aviation fuels will be seen as critical to decarbonize aviation. So just trying to draw a parallel with Ireland from a heat perspective, which is my area of work. I've taken this table from a recent report published by the Renewable Energy Ireland Association, where they are highlighting how industry in Ireland can achieve, and what are the key renewable heat technologies that will help achieving the vision of 40% of renewable heat by 2030 in Ireland. And as you can see, again, is a combination of renewable energy technologies. The potential for this is to deliver 67 terawatt hour per year for 2030, and the biggest share of this potential is actually represented by bioenergy. So the combination of solid biomass, biogas, and biofuel is seen as important in Ireland to meet the 40% target, which ultimately will be important to meet the government 7% CO2 abatement target. Just to conclude really on sustainability, because this is very, very important. Sustainability for bioenergy, recognizing there's going to be an expansion in bioenergy over the next decades, we really need to make sure that biomass is sourced sustainably and meets any most up-to-date and science-led, evidence-based sustainability criteria. And the UK's bioenergy sustainability governance framework is widely recognised as one of the most comprehensive frameworks globally. He's aligned to RED II, but really goes also beyond RED II in terms of requirements. Also, there are some independent voluntary certification schemes, such as the Sustainable Biomass Programme, which go beyond national practices, are recognised within regulatory systems. And our biomass, large-scale biomass industry in the UK, they are audited and certified under this programme. So sustainability regime is really important. It's also important that he responds to any expansion of the sector, and has highlighted on this slide, this evolution needs to be science-led and done in collaboration between government and industry. It needs to be proportionate and not hinder current proven approaches to sustainable biomass provision. It needs to be principle-based, avoiding black and white prescriptive criteria, which could fail to recognise differences in regional practices, in forest and management requirements, and also ensure they don't undermine the confidence of the businesses and investor community. And just to conclude, to let you know that as we speak today, the Declaration on Sustainable Bioenergy is being launched in Glasgow. It is a coalition of a number of organizations that are particularly involved in the wood-based biomass bioenergy. And they basically, again, they recognize, acknowledge that bioenergy, according to the International Energy Agency and also the IPCC, there will need to be a significant growth and expansion in the bioenergy sector, but sustainability must be at the heart of this expansion. And they include a set of sustainability principles in 4 main areas that need to be followed by this industry. I won't mention them all now, but perhaps after the presentation today, I can send the link to the declaration that's been launched today in Glasgow. So that's really what I wanted to cover. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kiara, for a very interesting presentation and for giving us your insights into what has happened at COP, but also it's very interesting to hear the approach of the UK government in terms of biomass, bioenergy. There's just one question in, and we may take it now, just from Donald there. Thanks, Donald, for joining us this morning. He asks, is the standard biomass heating gone in the UK unless it is combined with CCS or CHP? So I suppose what supports are currently there, and is the future involving CCS or CHP?
Sorry, in which sector in particular are we referring to?
So the question is standard biomass heating gone in the UK unless it is combined with CCS or CHP?
No, I think in the domestic heating sector, I think, and commercial heating sector, it is not gone. The government has just released a heat and building strategy where they set out their vision on renewable heats and how to decarbonize heat in the UK. And there is a huge amount of focus on electrification, of course, but they do also recognize that biomass, in this case, obviously we're talking about small scale, so CCS won't be economically viable, is still has a niche role, an important role to play in some niche applications like off the gas grid, rural properties, so in domestic heating, and at an industrial scale. I haven't seen any any requirement of prescriptions that CCS needs to be included. Yes. But although I guess that it depends on the scale.
I think it was in reference to renewable electricity, that if biomass was to be used for renewable electricity in the future, that CCS is going to be part of that.
Yeah, that's the emphasis that is placed on it's on power. It's on large scale biomass power generation. The government will not support it unless it's combined with CCS. For industry, they say that bioenergy without CCS, when CCS is not cost effective or feasible, it is possible as long as it goes to decarbonize hard to treat sector. So, industry that are really hard to electrify. Electrification is always the first choice, according to our government. But if it can be done, then yeah.
Okay, that's the only question that has come in. But if anyone else has any questions, please post them in the Q&A tab and we can come back to them later on in our webinar. So if I could now ask James to just to turn on your camera and to join us. So you're welcome, James, and thanks very much for joining us from Glasgow this morning. And it's good to get an update from on the ground as to what's happening from a COP perspective. And we've got a broad outline from Kiara as well as to what the key and main publications have been to date and announcements. So James, if I could just bring you in and maybe ask you, being at COP, what's the mood there, and are you seeing substantial discussion on the detail of how these climate action measures can be progressed?
Good morning, Sean. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm in my Airbnb before heading in for the sessions today at COP. The mood is mixed, and there's kind of highs and lows on depending on what day of the week it is. And there's been some kind of major announcements last week. We've been short on announcements this week. Today's Transport Day. Tomorrow is the second last day. Maybe these will there'll be some new major announcements coming out before the final kind of adding up of the commitments at the end of the week to see how short they are of the final objective and how much more negotiation they have to do over the weekend to try and bridge the gap. There are a couple of really big issues with the whole process. One is that clearly the commitments being made by all these countries aren't big enough, and that's very evident. And number two, even the commitments that are made are, they're unsand. There's no legal basis to them, as Kiara was saying. There's no way of scrutinizing them, monitoring them. There are no sanctions if people don't stick to them. So there's this. It's really a collective New Year's resolution without any teeth to it, and that really is a big problem. Yeah.
And just as a matter of interest, is bioenergy a theme at the COP, or is it featuring as a discussion point and being recognised as a key?
In contrast to previous COPs, there is actually very little in terms of substantive discussion on any of the specific topics to do with decarbonisation, whether it's agriculture or transport fuel or heating fuel or aviation and so on, or power generation. There's very little in terms of technical and industrial, commercial, trade discussions around that. In previous COPs, there would have been events and panel discussions and meetings between industry associations and other stakeholders, between big kind of movers and shakers in these sections on what was going on. And you could actually engage on that, and there were forums in which serious substantive discussions could take place. This year, that seems to be largely missing. And so, COP this year is comprised really of, 3 or 4 themes. One is obviously the central negotiations of the UN and the countries around the world, and that's obviously something that nobody has visibility on except themselves. Then there are kind of official UN sessions open to most of the attendees, but they're kind of pre-baked, fairly bland meetings without much to do with specifics. Then there's a kind of a circus to which I'm kind of part of, which is like a trade fair, but it's where pretty well anybody with there could be national pavilions in the trade fair, there could be NGO pavilions in the trade fair, there could be it's a kind of a random assortment of organizations, but they tend to be very high level, very often tangential to climate action, so they can have to do with indigenous populations or youth or gender or whatever, rather than strictly focused on the kind of logistics of solving the issue. And then really, apart from the core negotiations, the other really important theme is the media presence and the media activity. So it's all about the media talking back to their countries and to their publics and finding interviewees and generating conversations around the whole thing, which is allowing the kind of world's public to digest what's going on. And that's really the important thing. Not to omit Greta Thunberg last week. There's been no sign of her this week, but certainly last week she was very kind of critical in shaping opinion of how things are going.
And I just heard at the weekend our own minister speaking that about some of the commitments made, that there wouldn't be enough. But what's the view from the people there in terms of the country's commitments around cutting emissions? You mentioned about a series of New Year's resolutions. That doesn't sound too promising in terms of concrete commitments. So
I don't think it's promising at all. Just as there isn't much substantive discussion of the progress that needs to be made and how to be made in such a short time frame, there isn't enough scrutiny of the commitments and the seriousness of them. And even our own commitment as a country, essentially, our government has been signing up to all the commitments and promising to be top of the class in all of these things. But if you look at our own commitment, which is the Climate Action Plan published last week, and I had quite a detailed look at it over the last couple of days, if you had to give a probability of that plan bringing the 51% cuts by 2030, the probability is very low. So if we're top of the class, what are the other countries doing in terms of saying things that they don't mean? Our own climate action plan, the 3 main pillars of it are the million electric vehicles, the 500,000 house insulation refits with heat pumps, and in my own estimation, 3,000 or 4,000 wind turbines. Those 3 numbers are huge numbers to achieve in themselves, so difficult to achieve. And even if they were achieved, they wouldn't bring the level of progress required. And then the rest beyond those 3 pillars is just a massive collection of fairly soft, unmeasurable, vague commitments. So I'd want to see Ireland, for its own sake, audit that, so, you know, some independent body audit it, and then everybody is going to be calling for some kind of mechanism whereby the commitments to the COP process are audited as well, so that you're not just adding up what people say they'll do, but you're adding up what you think they'll really do.
Okay, and just taking it back, and we can come back to the discussion of the Climate Action Plan with Paddy there in a couple of minutes. Which was maybe, you mentioned today is Transport Day at COP. So you, obviously, a strong advocate in terms of renewable transport yourself, and involvement in biogas and bioethanol and other areas with regard to transport. What topics are going to be discussed today, and what are the likely outcomes from those discussions?
Yeah, so well, so there's the topics, again, it's reasonably random. It's not as if there's a central transport organizer who sets up a program that has kind of a beginning in the middle and the end. The transport ministers are over today. I was speaking with the journalist last night who's going to be interviewing a couple of the transport ministers, and was asking me what to ask them about. And he said that the themes are going that he had on his mind were aviation and hydrogen in transport, based on the, to me, misguided assumption that, you know, the transport problem has generally been solved on road and rail by electricity, which it hasn't, and that hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels were the theme. So I said to him, well, if you're talking, he says he definitely has an interview with one of the key transport ministers today, and possibly others. As regards hydrogen, just bear in mind that hydrogen is essentially electricity converted into a gaseous form with a big loss of energy along the way. So yeah, sure, hydrogen, great, but where are you getting the electricity? And as we've seen in Ireland in the last few days, there's a kind of an electricity crunch, and that's happening everywhere. So contrary to the, you know, conventionally accepted wisdom that electricity is becoming virtually cheap and they might be paying us to take it, it's going the other way, and it'll keep going the other way for a long time. So be careful of hydrogen. And I even heard on RT this morning hydrogen being kind of promoted as a kind of a panacea. Great, but careful. And
hydrogen is probably a fuel or technology that's going to come maybe towards the end of this decade. It's and maybe even into the next decade, when we have other mainstream available technologies like biomethane, bioethanol, biodiesel, other fuels available that can be immediately deployed.
Hydrogen to me is, obviously I love hydrogen. I'm an engineer. I've worked in the hydrogen area for a couple of years, and everybody, you can't not love hydrogen. But the one kind of tough fact about hydrogen is you need a whole load of electricity to make it. And until you've got loads of electricity, not to mention the infrastructure and the vehicles and so on, until you've got loads of cheap electricity, you're certainly not going to have loads of hydrogen. And as long as people are aware of that, and not to allow distract us from doing what we have to do today, which often involves, you know, biofuels and biogas and other forms of bioenergy and other solutions. So there's a risk that it could distract people even from, you know, public transport and modal shift and biofuels and all the other things, because it seems like a panacea. And on the aviation fuels, to be careful that the airlines and the oil companies are making announcements about their entry into the sustainable aviation fuel businesses. Where are they going to get the stuff? There are, if you add up the announcements of the oil companies in terms of processing capacity to produce a sustainable aviation fuels, they come to, you know, more than the volumes of biofuels that are being produced already on the planet, or close to. And so fine, but, you know, there has to be an assessment of where it's all going to come from, and there has to be tough kind of standards applied to ensure that it's all done sustaintably. Okay,
just one point, it's kind of a separate matter from COP. I heard you yesterday morning, James, on RT Morning Ireland, and I believe this week that the EU ombudsman found that there is a case of maladministration on the part of the EU Commission in relation to biofuels. So maybe could you just very briefly explain the background to this, because I think it would be of interest to a lot of our attendees this morning.
Yeah, well, it comes back to a bit about the sustainable aviation fuel question, which is that when the regulators create markets for renewables, so essentially new products or greatly expanding existing products and whatever those forms of renewable energy they are, there has to be very strict standards to ensure that they're genuine and they're sustainable and so forth. And my problem with the European Commission was that I asked them to supply country of origin information regarding biofuels in Europe so that we could see where they were coming from, and the public stakeholders could analyze that and come to their own opinions on whether those biofuels were coming from the right places or not. And what I mean is Ireland, like several other European countries, is very, very heavily dependent on used cooking oil biodiesel for its renewable energy and transport. And used cooking oil biodiesel is clearly the best, one of the best forms of biofuels. There's no question about that. That's why it's so popular. But it has to be genuine. And the risk is that some of it's palm oil, virgin palm oil, relabeled illegally as used cooking oil. And because the chain of custody for that stuff coming through isn't always, the European standards for assuring that it's genuine are not strong enough, there should be information available to all stakers to go and figure that out for themselves. And the European Commission isn't releasing that data. I went to the Ombudsman and said, I think they should release the data. They're saying no. And the Ombudsman, after quite a lengthy deliberation, concluded that I was right and that the Commission should be giving that. And the Commission refused even the request of the Ombudsman, and ultimately determined that the Commission was, that there was a case of maladministration in terms where the Commission's attitude was concerned.
Okay, and just on that, how often, just as a matter of interest, would the Ombudsman per year announce cases of maladministration? Is this a rare occurrence or is it a regular occurrence? Or?
It's actually quite rare because the Ombudsman receives about 2,000 petitions a year. 3/4 of them generally relating to issues with the European Commission, and then the other quarter with other European institutions. And out of those 2,000, only maybe 4 or 5 every year actually end up as negative, cases of maladministration. So they consider it very carefully before they do it, because they actually published it today on the Ombudsman's website, and it becomes a matter for the European Parliament to resolve. So it doesn't end here.
Okay. Thanks, James. Very important work, and thanks for your contribution this morning. And I'd ask you to stay on screen, and we just bring in Paddy and also bring back in Kiara. So Paddy, while you're coming on screen there and giving your video on, just a couple of comments in the chat there. So from Norman, thanks Norman for joining. Climate tracker assessments show quite a shortfall with respect to limiting temperature rise, much more pessimistic than IEA assessments. And then a follow-on comment that the EU monitors closely EU national progress, giving oversight, and there's no such for the rest of the world, unfortunately. So that is a challenge. And thanks to Mark as well for your comment. So if I could bring you in, Paddy, I think we heard from Kiara the UK government publishing their biomass policy statement and outlining the role of bioenergy in the various decarbonisation of the various sectors. I suppose we would be quite envious of that in terms of the detail that's there, and the proposal to publish a bioenergy strategy in the UK in the next couple of months, as per Kiara's presentation. So we got our own version in terms of the climate action plan last week. So would you be able to give us your thoughts, Paddy, as IrBEA president, and indeed in your own work and role in the 3-county energy agency, in terms of what your view is of the climate action plan that was published, and maybe your overall view of it from a bioenergy perspective, and indeed in general in terms of achieving the objectives that are very ambitious.
Thank you, Sean. And on behalf of IrBEA and all its members, I would like to thank James and Kiara for their inputs this morning. It's great, for many centuries now, it's great to see a policy launched in the UK, which, if history tells us anything, would be quite easy to deduct an awful lot of its text and move it across into Irish legislation. But leaving that to one side and not having had a chance to read it in great detail, as you suggested, Sean, it's quite strong in its claim, or its identification that bioenergy has a very large part to play. particularly, I think, just from your slides, Kiara, identifying in those areas that are not connected to the gas grid. And if you look at, tying that back to the Three Counties Energy Agency and where we work in Southeast Ireland, the southern region, there are only 4 or 5 of the main urban centres that are connected to natural gas. So it's quite relevant in our view. And our resource assessments in this region would identify significant availability of biomass, bioenergy resources. And I think it's really positive to see carbon capture attached to it, because that's a very logical approach. However, what I will point to there is the need for technology advancement, and be very interested in collaborating with you in your role in the UK, in the Irish context of, we specifically have identified many resources, be it energy crops, forestry residues, all the timber wastes, etc., that you've identified, right across to the bio transport fuels and so on and so forth, and maybe partnering or peering up in terms of working to support our government to identify these policies. And that leads me neatly back to our climate action plan, which was published last week. So just to summarize that early jumble of words, if that makes sense for members, we know what the resources are, we know where they are, we know where we're not connected to the gas grid, and the real challenge now is to convert those potential, for anyone from an engineering or a science background, they understand the term potential energy, and we want to convert that into kinetic energy using innovative technologies. And the technology piece there, particularly aligning to carbon capture, is interesting. Coming back to the climate action plan, and I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for IrBEA, specifically in what I have read so far. What it does show is a continued, very large ambition to decarbonise the Irish economy. I think that's quite positive. If we think back 5 or 7 years, we didn't have anything like that in terms of ambition. The fact that a lot of it is idealistic, and a lot of the measures identified in it, just one fact, there are 496 measures identified in the climate action plan published last Thursday, I think, maybe Wednesday. I'm losing days, not to mind weeks and months in this year. In the last 2019 climate action plan, there was 178 actions listed. Of those 178 actions, there was a specific task reportee or responsibility. There was a list of stakeholders that were to be engaged in delivering that task, and there was a timeline given for it to be completed. We still await a timeline for the revised climate action plan, which has over twice, almost 3 times the number of actions, with no pointed to responsible entity, whether it be industry or whether it be government or semi-state or whomever, and no timeline. But it does state that a climate action plan will be published more regularly. So that's just one thought, one comment. So it's very hard to follow a plan when there's no program or no timelines. The other piece is it does have several mentions of bioenergy, be it across transport, be it across heat and electricity. It doesn't give a specific percentage of heat. So as per your own slide, Kiara, you will have seen that IrBEA, supported by the Renewable Energy Ireland umbrella group, launched a 40 by 30 heat plan. And we had hoped to see a 40% renewable heat target by 2030. That hasn't made its way into the plan. But what they have stated is that on receipt of or completion of the SEAI renewable heat study, which is underway at the moment, and which IrBEA have consulted into, they will be in a better position to consider where those targets might be. But it is disappointing that industry haven't taken the positive step to do the assessment of the potential resources, the potential end users of this heat, particularly in the industrial heat load, which is hard to electrify, that we haven't seen that, a big step forward in that space will deliver a large percentage in terms of renewable heat going forward. And I think that's echoed in your own slide there. I just took a snip of it for the record, so I was able to reference it. And in it, just looking at the commercial industrial, hard to electrify heat loads, high temperature heat is really what we're talking about there. The other point you would note is on the economic front. So they have an interesting little slide. I possibly just need to show it, Sean, if that's possible.
No, that's no problem, Paddy. I think you should be able to share, and if you can't,
allow me to share it.
Rights, yeah.
It's some of these very interesting graphics, which take a little bit of time to read and analyze. I'm just going to share my screen now. Just bear with me just for 1 second. Hopefully this is of value. So you should be able to see my screen there now.
Yeah, it's just starting to share, yeah. There's multiple slides on your screen, so you just have to click early on the...
I'm going to zoom in on this one.
Yeah.
So this is in the context for this slide is it's within the economic cost or the business case for the climate action plan. And it boldly states that about 60% of the required action measures have a standalone business case. So in other words, they have a payback for the actor or society. But what that also does is identifies that 40% need intervention and need significant intervention for them to succeed. So the 40%, so I think, again, round figures, I think it was 175 billion euros was what they suggested the cost of delivering the plan.
I think.
Sorry, yeah, 125 billion euros. It's in the corner there, yeah. To deliver 100%, that 40% of that does not have a standalone business case. And therefore, when you identify the different opportunities and the negative business cases, I think reading from the UK's policy statement, and we're looking forward to seeing their plan next year, a significant number of supports will be required in that 40% space, and that society and the state need to identify that and no longer just evaluate it on a business case with a euro sign attached to it, but also look at it in the context of a business case for the climate. So I think that's, from an economic perspective, that's one of the points that I deducted from that specific slide, that they identify that not every action is going to have a return on investment, money-wise, but I do believe it would have some of those ones that have a negative business case will have, and our plan points to that, as does the transport plan that we've produced in association with Marii, identifies to government having to up the ante in terms of supporting the clean energy technology drive. So I hope that summarizes it, Sean.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive assessment, Paddy, certainly. James, would you have any comment? And maybe Kiara, would you have any comment on what you've heard? Either of you? Are your concerns, are Paddy's concerns shared, James, in terms of the lack of timelines, responsible departments?
It's devoid of any of the usual things you'd expect of a plan. So, who, what, how much, when, it's terrible. And now I've asked several members of the Climate Change Advisory Council if they would arrange for an audit of it to be done so that, somebody adds up all the numbers and comes to a view on how plausible they are and comes to a view on whether it's fit for purpose. Because, you could say, well, it's much better than what we've had before in terms of the ambition. That's true. It's not as good as Paddy was saying in terms of the actual actionability of the things. But the big thing about this plan is as far as I understand it, we don't have a second chance. It's not like we can try it out for the next 8 years, and if it doesn't work, we can do it again. Yes. That's the problem. It has to guarantee the result, and it doesn't come anywhere near that.
Okay, just if I could bring you in, Karen, I understand you wouldn't have read the Irish Climate Action Plan. We've just about skimmed through it ourselves because it's quite a large document with a lot of detail. But if you could just give us maybe you did explain in your slides the plans from a UK point of view in terms of biomass policy statements. Do those documents have the level of detail in terms of responsible actors, timelines, all of that that is lacking from an Irish perspective in terms of our own climate action plan?
So I can certainly see some parallels with the Irish Climate Action Plan. Not just the government released the biomass policy statement last week, but over the past few weeks, they released a raft of strategies, the heat and building strategy, the net zero strategy. The Treasury undertook a review to, what is needed, financially needed to reach net zero. We had a hydrogen strategy, so a lot of strategies. And when you look at the detail, again, I think, I mean, to be fair, the government seems to be identifying some really key actions and programs to decarbonize the different sectors and reach net zero, but there are still large policy gaps in the UK as well, or gaps in policies that should be enacted. For example, one of the gaps that we continue to reiterate to government is the industrial heat. That although again there was an industrial decarbonization strategy published last year, I think there still needs to be a financial support of some sort, whether that's a contract for difference type of mechanism, or whether it is a more like a feed-in tariff type of approach that encourage people to switch to to low carbon fuels and bridge that gap in cost between the high cost of generating renewable energy or clean technology and the low cost of fossil fuels. So we still see a large gap, even despite the fact that the government has release a lot of funds and competitions that will help addressing the industrial decarbonization issue in the UK. But I think we need more of an ongoing long-term financial support that de-risk investment and encourage people to switch to low carbon fuels. And there are other gaps.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Kiara, for that. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our session. So if there are any final questions that you'd like to pose, please post them straight away into the Q&A tab. So just to maybe ask for concluding remarks, and maybe in line with the COP Goal 4 theme of working together, James, would you like to just give any concluding remarks about how we make that happen over the next decade, from the point of view of decarbonisation, further deployment of bioenergy, so on that working together theme? So if you want to just give any concluding remarks you have for this morning's session.
Yeah, well, okay, thank you. I think we'll see over the next 6 months or a year, we'll see a lot higher profile for bioenergy in Ireland, that's for sure. And that's for the actors already in it. And I think the people who are already in it, who've gone through the sacrifice of the last 10 or 15 years on sticking with it, will probably do quite well. What's missed, I guess the regret is all the people who weren't encouraged to get into it because of the conditions and how much bigger it could be and should be. And so, yeah, I guess despite what I've been saying earlier on, I'm optimistic that things are going to improve quickly over the next year, because there will be more rigor and more of a need for solutions soon. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, James, and thanks for your contribution. And I hope COP, your remaining time at COP, is successful for you, and thanks for, I suppose, flying the bioenergy flag in Glasgow on behalf of the Irish bioenergy sector. Paddy, before I come to you, just one comment from Norman there. There is a role for open cycle steam compression, industrial heat pumps for upgrading heat and useful temperature, e.g. 0.5 bar to 2 bar gets temperature degrees to 120 degrees C. Usable in food industry, e.g. from CHP, IC cooling water, or e.g. from distilleries, condensing vapors and raising steam. So it's quite a technical point, but thanks, Norman, for the point, and it's something we can come back to maybe at a future webinar. But Paddy, could I ask you to just give your concluding remarks? Obviously, this is the 4th webinar in our series. This is concluding our conference series, and we will revert back in the next couple of weeks to our regular bioenergy webinar series. So if you just give maybe any concluding remarks of your thoughts in terms of, because you've participated in the first one and this one, but in general as well, to conclude today.
Thank you, Sean. I'd just like to thank Sean and the executive in IrBEA, Teresa, and all the team for arranging these 4 what I see as very useful webinars. I was part of the first one, and the first one really set about the existing technologies around biomass and biogas, biomethane, and how widespread they are across Europe and how not so widespread they are across the island of Ireland. Sorry, the southern part of that island. In that context, it really makes us wonder and identify, why are we so behind the curve in terms of bioenergy in this country? And in this final webinar, and I'd like to thank Maurice and our other colleagues in the MEC for standing in and presenting in the various other webinars, which unfortunately with time I wasn't able to attend. But culminating nicely in this one today, which looks at transport, which is the big energy user across all of our sectors, all of our nations and countries. But in that first one, we identified that there's a significant number of existing technologies that for the past decade have not seen widespread uptake in the Irish energy system. What we've seen in today's seminar is a policy statement from the UK where they have seen a significant uptake in terms of biomass heating and biogas technologies and biomethane production. And in that policy, it says that it sees bioenergy having a significant role. If I can frame shot my mind, I think a figure of 18% was one of the figures that was listed there of total energy in the industrial sector can be provided from biomass where it's difficult to electrify. I suspect, without knowing the numbers, but 18% of the total final energy consumption in the UK is a significant energy number. And it's great to see the UK giving its commitment to it playing its part. And that brings me back to the point that the Climate Action Plan, although it name checks various technologies and various energy sources, clean heat and clean transport are going to have to come from a multiple of sources. And it's using, and I paraphrase the current chair of the Climate Council and the former chair of Renewable Energy Ireland in her analogy to a stained glass window. So a stained glass window is put together with many different panes of glass of different shapes and sizes. But together it keeps the cold out and the heat in. And if we look at all the varying technology solutions across all the varying renewable energy sources, then I believe it must be an all-encompassing policy and support mechanisms that are put in place to help. And fundamentally, I field calls every day. I know IrBEA fields calls every day, and I know many of the panelists and the members today will field calls every day of people who want to change but cannot get access to the supports or the pathway to make that change. And that's really where a modal shift needs to happen, a shift in time, a shift in space, to make it accessible and easier for people to make that climate change. And bioenergy is going to have a significant part to play in that. So thank you all again, Sean.
Yes, thanks, Paddy.
And again, just to reiterate, thanks James and Kiara for a very excellent presentations and update from Climate COP today.
Pleasure.
Okay. Kiara, I don't know if you have any concluding remarks. Apologies, I should have gone to you before Paddy, but
okay.
Just to thank you for your time and effort and for getting involved
just to say, but Sean, just quickly to say, the IrBEA is and has always been very keen to work with other trade associations. So I think cross establishing and partnering with you, establish a strong collaboration. We are very happy to share our experience, and so yes, let's keep talking.
Yes, indeed, and thanks very much for that. We will certainly engage further with you in due course. So with that, we conclude this morning's webinar. Thanks very much to Kiara, thanks to James, and thanks to Paddy for joining us. I'd like to thank all our attendees this morning. With a nice turnout this morning, and also to thank all of you that joined us over the last 3 webinars for our conference special series. I'd like to echo Paddy's comments and thank Teresa O'Brien for all her hard work and efforts in terms of making this all work smoothly. And so thanks, Teresa, for everything that you do for us. And just to say good day to you all, and we look forward to welcoming you back at a future webinar, which we'll publish details of on our social media channels over the coming weeks. So with that, we conclude, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.